Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the weeks of June 22nd through July 5th of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Now, um, before we start, we're going to start in the Kostyantynivka direction because that is where the biggest news has come from for these last 2 weeks. But I'm recording this on a new computer, so if I sound different or I'm hoping it sounds better. And the best thing about this, as I hope, is that when I'm showing you guys around the map, it doesn't glitch out like my old laptop. So yeah, I'm on my new PC. Hopefully it doesn't do anything bad, but we'll see. But I'm yeah, so that's why I have a new setup and it's all good. So yeah, that's why I might sound a little different. But let's begin in the Konstantinovka direction. Alrighty, so this week the biggest news, let's get it out of the way. This is what we're here for. Konstantinovka has fallen. The Russians have captured the city. And now it is, and now again, I talked about this last time. It's like, well, for example, the Russians could, or the Ukrainians could continue like this. They actually did the same thing in Toretsk, if you guys remember this from like a little over a year and a half ago when the Russians captured Toretsk in early 2025. The Ukrainians would continue sending infiltration groups into these like northern suburbs of Toretsk and basically did not, even though the Russians have captured like maybe the big mine shafts and the central like high rise buildings, the Ukrainians for a long time kept sending suicide units into these kind of northern outskirts here, and they to deny that they have completely taken Turesk, and it's probably the same thing that's going to happen in Konstantinivka if the Russians don't continue their advance. Now, I've talked about this before that the Russians, have a very, what they're going to do. They actually should do this regardless. Is that they need to clear out this pocket in this area right here between Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka. They need to clear out all the Ukrainians that are here, and but with the fall of Konstantinivka, the Ukrainian situation here is very precarious. It's very hard to supply them. So the Russians will clear this out. But even with regardless of that, is that the Russian I always said that, obviously the next target is Alexandria Dnipropetrovsk here, this tiny town city right here, onto the way towards the big city of Driskovka. But the thing is that the Ukrainians can still do counter. For example, they did a counterattack about a couple days ago where they managed to enter, this northern residential area of Konstantinivka and then got destroyed. So they could probably still, send troops to infiltrate these areas and to deny that like, oh, technically these areas are part of Konstantinivka. So they're like, oh, actually no, Konstantinivka can still be contested, but all of it is for PR purposes. They just don't want to. The thing is, for all intents and purposes, the Russians are in control of 95% of Konstantinivka. They have cleared out most of the people who are there. There might be some still, obviously it's after the capture of a city, there's a time period afterwards where you still have to clear basements. You have to start establishing logistics depots, drone operators, like medical areas. This is where the Russians were going to build up their places as the forward assault groups advance towards Alexandrivka Driskovka here. I'm going to start calling this Little Driskovka here to compare it to the big one. But yeah, the Russians also, we had geolocation, for example, the Russians, raising their flag here and even being up here. The interesting part, they actually didn't raise anything in this area, but we've had geolocations of the Russians being bombed, at least in this area right here. But yeah, you can see it's pretty easy for the Ukrainians to infiltrate this. So I actually wouldn't doubt that if the Russians stop here and just like maybe focus their attention somewhere else, let's say, they cleared out this pocket up in the north here, and then they just stop, and have, the front line go something like this. The Ukrainians will continue infiltrating the northern part just for PR purposes, just to, so that when they announced their thing, their reports to the Western powers, they're like, oh, actually, the battle for Konstantinivka is still ongoing. That's why if you look at, like, say, the battle for Toretsk, it ends like 6 months after the Russians finally captured it because, the Ukrainians kept, infiltrating the most northern outskirts to claim they still battling for it. But yeah, Konstantinivka, the actual main battle for like the industrial zones, the high-rise buildings have been completely captured by the Russians, and they're also now just establishing themselves in these northern residential areas. So very good news for the Russians. I do think that they're gonna clear this northern pocket, try to take Dobropillya, and then advance towards Little Driskovka here. Now the thing is, obviously, for example, after Pokrovsk and Minigrad fell, everyone thought they'd continue advancing towards Dobropillya, for example. But it seems like the Russians are only putting their efforts into one area now. maybe maybe they think like, okay, instead of once Konstantinivka falls, they're going to redeploy forces to this group of forces center and try to take Dobropillya because they think taking Dobropillya and taking this kind of area right here will allow them to start putting the pressure on Driskovka. But the thing is that I do think that's the case for Driskovka, but I think for Little Driskovka, this town right here, I do think the Russians, while the Ukrainians are on their heels retreating, would be the best time to take this town and also to continue advancing in this area right here. So, if the Russians could take, something like this, right? Then, the line is, it's not like, if they take Little Driskovka that they're going to be outflanked or whatever, I do think that they still have the Jews to push here and they should still focus their efforts on taking this town. Now, if they want to advance towards Driskovka, maybe, it might be time to then, once they take Little Driskovka, maybe it might be time to redeploy forces towards Dobropillya to then, maybe take, you know, something like this. And if they do something like that, then they could, put obviously, the logistics to Driskovka under tight control, and then they could start, infiltrating it. So, maybe that, if they want to take Driskovka, maybe they want to take Dobropillya. Just like, for example, after they took Pokrovsk, they focused back on Kostyantynivka, for example, because they thought taking Kostyantynivka required the Russians to be in control of Pokrovsk and Leningrad, for example. So we shall see, but I do think that will be where the Russians will advance next. We're not going to go to the Slavyansk direction, but I'm actually thinking of renaming this entire area from Konstantinivka all the way up to the Sovietsky Donetsk River here as like the kind of the fortress belt city, the Slavyansk Kramatorsk line, because from now on, it's no longer they're battling for Konstantinivka; they're now going to be going towards Druskovka. But yeah, these are what they call the fortress cities of Donbass. These areas right here. So, we will, this is like the main fortification defenses for all of Donbass. But as I mentioned in my last video, it's actually the Russians actually do want to attack in urban areas. They want actually, in my opinion, they actually want to get into these cities as quickly as possible. So they're probably just going to do this like infiltration from the up here, and then maybe once they advance from here as well to enter these areas right here. They do actually want to have urban battles because that allows them to negate the where the Ukrainians put most of their defense on, which is drones. The Ukrainian infantry is in a very bad state. So, once you actually, they're able to try to keep the Russians at bay with vast amounts of drones. But once the Russians infiltrate, say, a big city, then suddenly those drones, it's very hard for those drones operators actually take out the Russians. So, and with the little Ukrainian infantry there is, it's very hard to actually hold on to a city. That's why once the Russians actually entered Konstantinivka, it fell relatively quickly in terms of how cities fall in this war. Yeah, just drinking some lemonade right now. Anyway, but yeah, this entire area, the Slavyansk direction, will be kind of combined with this area, Konstantinivka, to kind of maybe like the Fortress Belt line or whatever, maybe the Slavyansk Kramatorsk line, the SKD line or whatever. Anyway, so, but yeah, let's talk about what's actually happening in like this like kind of area right here. Now, this is where the Russians are also making lots of progress as well. For example, this week we had them raising their flags all over the town of Malininovka here. We had a geolocation of the Russians being in Tanivka. They've claimed they also captured this village right here. So it seems like the Russians are actually establishing themselves in, with a bridgehead on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, because they didn't want the Ukrainians to use these villages to be able to infiltrate and just they want to have a secured position across it here. Now, will they continue advancing? Will they advance towards Peshmermanovka, Besunivska? The thing is about this area is that this is just a bunch of small villages, a bunch of open fields, and there's a ton, and I mean a ton of Ukrainian drone operators that are operating in Kramatorsk. And so if the Russians try to advance towards Kramatorsk through these basically open fields for the most part, they will be, it'll be very hard to approach it. I'll say that. Right now, what the Russians want to do is create a good defense line so that the Ukrainians want to counterattack. It will be, they have places they could attack them from. Now, so yeah, that's what's happening there. And so yeah, building a bridge on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal is a very good news for the Russians. Along with this, the Russians made another big progress in taking the town of Pushinivka here. We actually had a ton of flags being raised in this village right here. So it does seem like, last time they took this dacha, and then the weeks before that they had Krylovka. So it seems like they're slowly but surely moving across these areas, using the river as their, defense on the north. And then, they're counting that, the Ukrainians in these kind of like forests are, not in a position to leave those areas because then they'll be attacked. So they're using the village to defend themselves from the drone operators. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if maybe within, maybe by the time I get back in the next video, they take Drubivka here. And, from here, the Russians will try to start infiltrating Mykolaiivka, which will be the biggest battle this is the main effort for the Slavyansk direction at this current moment. I talked about this last week as well, or my last video as well. Taking Nikolaevka is a very, will be a very bad news for the Ukrainians. This is where, because once the Russians take it, they can use Nikolaevka to start as a operating base to start infiltrating these districts of Slavyansk, and also just help cut off more and more of the logistics for the Ukrainians still battling in Lyman as well. So Mykolaiivka is going to be a big battle, though. The Ukrainians aren't going to give it up very, very quickly, but the Russians are going to definitely put, all these supply areas under tight drone control. So it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to supply their forces in Mykolaiivka. But that is where the Russians are going to be focusing on right now. They're just slowly but surely starting to, again, just like with Alexandrivka, where they were slowly but surely, focused on there. Now that, that is almost basically done, they're now going to do the same thing with Nikolaevka here. They're slowly but surely clearing out these like kind of fields between Alexandrivka and Krylovka. As I mentioned before, they were kind of going like kind of through the kind of using the villages as stepping stones, and they were kind of avoiding the open fields here because they didn't want to get caught out in the open. But slowly but surely, it's just, if you're a Ukrainian trying to hold up, say in these tree lines, it's just very hard for you to do so because your flanks are exposed and, it's just, you can't be supplied except through drones. So slowly but surely, the Russians are just going to clearly, just clear these areas, one by one. And, the front line will go something like this. So it'll be something like that soon. And, the Russians will probably continue trying to infiltrate Orikivka here. Probably try to, use the thick vegetation along the canal to infiltrate this area. Probably use this forest and Rayak and Drivka as bases to try to do infiltrations to the southern part of Nikolaevka. And then obviously there's going to be advancements to the Slavyansk thermal power plant, which is the main defense base for Nikolaevka from the north here. So yeah, that's just slowly but surely that's what's happening. So right now the Russians are just consolidating in Alexandrivka, moving across the northern Savetsky Donetsk River, just slowly but surely squeezing out whatever is left of any Ukrainian holdouts in these forests. And once they reach this area, then they'll start trying to take Nikolaevka, which I do think they might be able to take it sometime, maybe by September. I think by September is a good estimation. But and then once they have that, it'll be a really great place for the Russians to accumulate forces and all that. So yeah. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, and in the Lyman direction, there's actually not been that much changes. We talked about last week how we had a lot of videos of the Russians being all over Lyman, just walking all over the place here. And then the end of but in these last, in the end of June and starting in July, we started not getting really any. We haven't got any more updates. The Russian sources are saying they're still clearing out the areas. They haven't, they're still just taking more and more areas. The Ukrainians are saying that those were just infiltrations. They were killed immediately. So, but we haven't had any more, at least for me, I haven't seen any more info showing like what exactly is going on here. I do, the battle for, but at least what everyone does agree is the battle for Lyman is still ongoing. But before that, we talked about how this entire area, for the most part, turned into a giant gray zone because the Russians are able to infiltrate all this. But now don't know, like, is there an area where the Russians have consolidated? Is there an area where the Ukrainians still hold pretty solid control? But we do know, like, kind of the main Ukrainian defenses is around the big railway station and the high-rise buildings in the southern part of Lyman, and also kind of this northern area right here, just because it's the most farthest away from Russian infiltrations and closest to where they get supplied across the river and all that. So, Russian sources are also saying that they're have retaken Yampil. The southern part of Yampil kept getting infiltrated by Ukrainians, and so that's why Syria has this as like a gray zone, for example. But Russian sources are saying they've reestablished control here, and that they're slowly but actually pushing, clearing out the Ukrainians from Dubrovin and Orozhina, which is where the fighting is still ongoing. But Yampil is under full Russian control, at least according to pro-Russian sources. But we shall see about that. But I do think it's definitely possible. Now the biggest thing is that we got more news about this kind of Ukrainian counteroffensive in the northern part of Lyman here, in the Lyman direction. So, but now, for example, we had a geolocation of the Ukrainians trying to getting attacked, or not attacked, but attacking and then getting destroyed right up on the northern part of Novi. And as I mentioned before, Novi is the big, is the big kind of linchpin of all this. Novi is the big center that the Russians were using to defend their northern flank here. And the fall of Rekadup is, so according to, this entire area is getting cleared by, was like kind of taken by these Ukrainian counterfests of like Rekadup and Kharkov. However, we had geolocations of the Russians raising their flags, or, kind of showing themselves being, in these, in Novi and alrighty. Hold up. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so for some reason, so also just I have a new headset as well, as you would say, so it just became retarded. Yeah, I'm still figuring this out. Hopefully, over the course of these couple of weeks, I'll figure all this stuff out. But we're still here. Anyway, the what was I going on about? Yeah, so the Russians were showing that they're like, yeah, they're still in control. So this kind of might be more of like a fluid gray zone here. Maybe, where maybe there's interlapping Russian Ukraine positions and so forth. So maybe it's less of a solid Ukrainian control and more like, oh, we're still here and all that. Um, so we shall, but again, the Russians do want to probably reassert control over this area at least. They do not want the Ukrainians, even if it's intermixed positions, to be in Karpovka and Rikadup. They don't want to have the northern flank exposed here. So the southern flank is being more secure, but it's this northern flank that's kind of being a bit more shaky. But we shall see how that develops. Also, around this like Luhansk area is that we actually had geolocation of the Russian DRGs being active in Novimiria, in I think it was even in Cherna here, and Kopany. So, the Russians haven't claimed they've captured these places, but we did see Russian activity here. So it does show that this is less of a, it shows that this kind of line of Ukrainian defense in the Kharkov Oblast can be infiltrated. But it's probably not going to be fully secured by the Russians until the Russians start, once they take Liman, and then once they clear out this Kupyansk area and they start putting the pressure on Borova, and then, slowly but surely the Ukrainians will have to retreat from this Borova pocket here. All right. Now we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction, and this is an area where the Russians actually have really good news. The what they call the Kupyansk Oskol bridgehead for the Ukrainians is slowly but surely being liquidated. We had more and more geolocations that the Russians have taken basically almost most of Kupiansk Vozhenoye, that only the southern part remains and is in a gray zone anyway, because we had Russians being here. It's just maybe they're not. And the reason why they're maybe not fully consolidated as of yet is because the main kind of entryways into this area were, through here, and like through here. So this is why, like, for example, like this area right here is still being contested, because this is where, the Ukrainians are the mainly entering and all that. This is like the entrance to the bridgehead. But slowly but surely, just everything that's being liquidated. They've completely taken Polodny. Isn't the eastern part of Kupyansk, for example, the northern part of Kupyansk and central part of Kupyansk Vozhenoye, most of Kisharovka. We had geolocation of the Russians being in Nova Salonia. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had the Russians being in Glushkovka. But so this entire area there's no, I would venture to say that in this entire, maybe except maybe in the forest and all that, there's probably no, the Russians are all over this area. Now there's still Ukrainian positions, like for example, Syriac says this built up area to the western part of Kisharovka is still under Ukrainian control. But the thing is that, there might be some, and for example, there might be some Ukrainians still holding out in the southern part of Kupiansk Vozhenoye. But it's these like pockets of resist are, they have to be supplied across the river, and it's just such a pain in the ass to be able to continue holding off here. So slowly but surely, the Russians are just consolidating in Kupiansk Vozhenoye and Kisharovka, and just slowly but surely the Russians will, clear out the Ukrainians from Nova Salonia. Glushkovka will be taken. The Russians will continue pushing towards until they clear out all of Kupiansk Vozhenoye. And then, once they take this like micro district right here, then, I think the Ukrainians will just retreat to the other side of the river. And then, as I mentioned before, once this bridgehead is finally cleared, which I do think they'll probably clear it by July, sometime in July, I think. well, once it's cleared, I do think that they will, this will allow them to actually be able to start expanding their bridgehead in Kupiansk because before when they took Kupiansk, their bridgehead here was still intact and they were able to. It was very hard to supply the Russians in Kupiansk, but now that the Russians have cleared out this kind of area on the other side of the Oskol, it's going to be actually a lot more easier to supply the Russian garrison that is trying to take Kupiansk because we're getting more and more geolocations that the Russians kind of in the northern part of Kupyansk here, kind of like along this river right here, that this area, this northern part is just being slowly but surely converted back into Russian control after being in kind of a gray zone. Now the southern part is still being is still under Ukrainian control, but it will allow the Russians to once they have a foothold in this northern part to continue expanding southward. And again, they like city battles because it allows them to actually consolidate in this area to avoid drones and all that. So I do think that the Russians will be able to create a Kupiansk bridgehead and then from there expand even further. Try to take, as I mentioned before, what they should have done before. Take these villages just around Kupiansk and then have this solid bridgehead from here. Because then once you have this solid bridgehead and your logistics are secured and you have a base of operations, then you could start infiltrating maybe towards Shinchenko or the kind of main goal for this thing is, as I've always mentioned, to link up with what the northern group is doing and kind of cut off this entire northeastern part of Kharkov, which I think is the main goal. But you need to have a solid bridgehead and to do that. And then also, I do think that they're also going to put some forces to then continue pushing southwards now that the northern part is cleared towards Borova. Try to put pressure here and help the forces that are fighting in this area, which I think is like the first Guards tank army and all that. So yeah, so I do think that, the main goal is to clear out everything on the east side of the Oskol, which means Lyman, which means Borova, and then create a Kupiansk bridgehead here. And then kind of the big goal here would also be then to take this eastern part here. So that's kind of the main goal for like this year, I think, for the Russians in this area. Alrighty, and now we're gonna go to the Kharkov direction, and this week we actually had a very interesting thing happening in the Kharkov direction. Before I talk about Kharkov, I'm gonna take another drink of my lemonade. But anyway, yeah. So some very interesting things are happening in this area. Now, we talked a lot of Ukrainian mappers and some neutral mappers are saying that that there's been some Ukrainian counterattack. They took back Kharasovka and Verkhrenie, Persharovka and Vilcha. But Ukrainian, pro-Russian sources are saying actually no, this they're still in control here. And not only that, this week the Russians announced a bunch of villages that they took in this area. They announced they took the village of Zelona Yar here, that they took the town of Ukrainska right here, and the town of Losovka. Now, not only the reason they took these is because they're on, I think, the other side of the Pilna River here. So it's actually the Russians are kind of slowly. If you actually look at their map, what they're saying is that they're just kind of using these like oh, sorry, I went too far. They're using these rivers as like kind of like this natural defense here. So they have something like this going on. Now, you know, we don't know like if this is just a gray zone. Like for example, it's very easy because of the way this war is. If you want to do propaganda, it's pretty easy to do so. So what could happen, for example, is there could be Russian troops operate. They might have entered Zelena High or Lozovka because of how small these villages are. There's probably not a lot of people there anyway. So they could probably have 2 or 3 troops in Losovka, for example, this area. But then it could be, and then like, oh, we entered it and we didn't die. Okay, we claim we took it. But maybe there's still some Ukraine soldiers here, or maybe it's just they entered it and then it's very hard to supply without drones, so maybe they retreat. Now, or maybe what is most likely the case is still interlocking positions because maybe they didn't clear every single house. Maybe there's a house that still has Ukrainian troops in it and all that. So, but there's like a Russian presence there, so it's not like a solid Ukrainian control. So, again, it's depends on how you look at it. So it could be that this entire kind of southern part here is this like kind of gray zone, but the thing is we actually didn't have any it wasn't like the Russians like raised their flags here to confirm it. It was just like a just a how do you say it? Just a report. So maybe So it is probably is still like a big of a gray zone here. There's probably Ukrainians can still infiltrate here, but but if the Russians are able to consolidate here, this allows them to continue to outflank. Oh yeah, they actually even claimed they took this too. The to start outflanking Belikovodsk. The thing with Belikovodsk is that the Ukrainians have their drone operators and their troops here, their main like kind of center of like resistance here, and all the approaches to here is just a bunch of fields. So this is actually the worst part. You don't, this, you don't actually want to, um, how do you say it? Actually, because to approach Bill Kolodowski from Volchansk or from the border, or from the west here is just extremely hard because the Ukrainians could kill you with drones and all that. So, um, it's gonna be very, very hard unless the Russians do some sort of mechanized attack towards Bill Kolodowski, for example. So to dismount troops here and all that. So, I think, like, infiltrations here are gonna be extremely hard to do and all that. So, but yeah, that's the interesting thing happening there. We shall see how that develops. Um, and then also the battle for Kazachalopa is still ongoing. The Russians have made more advancements here. We had Russians starting to enter the central part of Kazachalopa. I do think the Russians are going to continue trying to consolidate in the northern part. But right up their infiltrations are getting deeper and deeper into the city. And we shall see how that continues to develop. But again, if they could, take some of these kind of more built up areas in the central part, they'll be able to accumulate more and more forces and be able to have because once they take um Kasashalopa, there'll be a very big juicy gain for the Russians here, and we'll continue creating this buffer zone here. So we shall see how that goes. Alrighty. Now we're gonna go to the Sumy direction, and in the Sumy direction, the main thing that is happening is actually this northern built-up area right here. It seems like the main goal for the Russians in the Sumy direction is to take the second line of defense here. The first line of defense was from Yunaktovka and this area, and they took that, and then they had to repel a Ukrainian counterattack here. But it seems like now they are back on the offensive here. They've taken Malak. and Chkatrofika about a month ago now, or something like that. And it seems like now they're actually now expanding and taking more and more. For example, most sources are saying the Russians have taken the northern part of Ivola Nonosky here. Now, Ivola Nonosky is split into two by this river here. The Russians claim they took the whole village, but I do think it's probably they've only consolidated in the northern part here and managed to kick the Ukrainians out of here. The Russians are also are now have entered Novosich and are now battling for the village here. They are also have entered the this area of Pirasarivka here. So the main juicy target is the town of Kotatan, this area right here. So this is the biggest village town in this area, and the Russians this is like that's why I call this the Khotan defense line here, because once the Russians take this area and have something like this, they could then have a long line of villages they could use to put troops in, and then use the forest as natural cover from FPV drones and all that. And also, the Russians are back in Kondrativka. They got kicked out of here by the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but they re-entered it. We had geolocation of the Russians being here, so it looks like they're probably going to reestablish control over Kondrativka soon. But I do think kind of the main goal for the Russians is just to take this Khotin defense line, and then from here they'll be able to use these forests to infiltrate and put soldiers and all that. Um, Once they take the second defense line, maybe they'll stop. Who knows? Like, for example, we've seen this a lot where the Russians advance in one area, but they're not actually putting in. They don't put. Sumy is not like a big direction. It's just kind of like a distraction operation. So they're trying to like hold down troops here. So they're just trying to like tie down Ukrainian forces here from redeploying to Donbass. But if they could take something, so because if they take the second line defense, this expands the buffer zone. If they attacked here, that expands that buffer zone here. So we shall see how that goes. So so yeah, we shall see. The Russians are now battling for all these villages, and I do think they'll be eventually taking them during the summer campaign. And then also this area right here, the Russians are expanding, battling towards the town of Baksvisky here. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have entered this village and are battling for it. The thing is about this area, the Russians claim they took all these villages that are along the border here, but that was mostly for PR. Like, for example, like, oh, we took Biliberiza, but there's nothing there. Oh, we took Komarnovka. It's like just some small little houses and all that, or Kharkovka. Yeah, some like small little village huts and all that. These aren't areas that are actually areas per se. So, and the thing is that since this is just a bunch of open fields, it's just very hard for the Russians to advance through here and take these areas here. So, but if they if they manage to take Bafasky here, that'd be a good news for the Russians. But I don't. Yeah, I think this is just another area to pin Ukraine's forces and such. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk directions, this area right here. This is a very, the most interesting things are happening, or not the most, but like kind of very, this is one of the most clusterfucked areas I would say about of the front line so far. Um, Now let's talk. There's two areas I want to talk about. What I call the former South Donetsk direction here, and the Dnipropetrovsk direction here. So, this is where most of the battles are now ongoing. It seems like the Russian. Well, there's a lot of moving parts here. So let's talk about the South Donetsk direction right here. So, I talked about this last week, but the Ukrainians started a new offensive here again to disrupt the Russian logistics to slow down the Russian push towards Zaporizhia. Now, so this entire area so there's a river right here that kind of splits this area. So on the other side of the river, and then towards the Volcha River, there's basically this giant gray zone. Now it's not a pure gray zone. It's mostly, again, it's like kind of interlocking positions. Now, for example, what you could say is that kind of, for example, the town of Podunia and Tolstoya, the Ukrainians can't infiltrate there, but it's still under mostly Russian control. While as, for example, the towns of Zelona High and Andriivka Klitsilova, or Irsika, as the Russians call it, for example, we had geolocation of the Russians being bombed here. So it does show the Russians are probably still active in these two villages, but it's probably the Ukrainians are trying to build up a presence in these two villages. So it seems like they're back on the offensive here. The Ukrainians want to take Zelona High and Andriivka Klitsilova to probably because these are two big decent sized villages, and they'll be able to accumulate forces here. And the goal here is to probably push the Russians back to the other side of the river here, towards Komar and all that. But the Russians are, they are fighting back. Again, they're infiltrating these areas. So now it's just this giant gray zone, and it's it's back and forth here. So we shall see how that goes. Now, the biggest news probably, and I probably believe this happens, that the Russians were completely kicked out of Ivanovka. This is bad news for them in terms of trying to develop this bridgehead here. This also ruined their chances of taking the northern part of Novopavlovka as well. So it seems like they retreated back on the other side of the Volchka River here, back towards Filia and so forth. Yeah, so the Ukrainians are making some decent tactical victories here, but the Russians are trying to stop them from making it any more developed here. So we shall see how that goes. Same thing here. There's interlock. And we had Ukrainians infiltrating Alexandrograd and even Volskarevka, but the Russians are trying to reassert control here. Again, it's very hard because the Ukrainians can attack from here. So there's a lot of fluid dynamics happening here. But the South, the next offensive that the Ukrainians started this summer is in full swing. So, but it's now being counteracted. So now it's like this fluid gray zone. Same thing kind of happened here when the Ukrainians attacked in the wintertime, or in the springtime, more like it. However, we actually had a very big news happening this week in this direction. The Russians showed themselves raising their flags all over Alexandriivka. Last about a month ago, we had them raising their flags in Dobropillya here. But this week, in the last week or two, we've had them raising their flags in fucking Alexandriivka and Bolodarovka and Pisania, this village right here. And so it does show, so as you can see, if you look at the Volchka River and the Harnacha River here, right, they kind of interlocked like here. And so it seems like the Russians, this entire area, I would say down here, this area right here that I kind of list is a big gray zone. And again, but it seems like it's no longer like, oh, the Ukrainians have like strong positions here, and it seems like more that the gray zone is now moving upwards. That doesn't mean the Ukrainians can't infiltrate Vishania or Berezova, for example. That's why there's probably not solid Russian control, but it does show that it's less of like, oh, the Ukrainians are in kind of solid control of everything north here in this like kind of red circle that I wrote, and they're at the gray zone is them infiltrating here and down in these fields here, and it's more looking like that. This is an area where while the Russians can still be infiltrated in this area, it's more like now the gray zone is being pushed towards the Volga River itself. Because the actual stable places of Ukraine controls in the big cities of Pokrovsk and Mikhailivka, and then they have to cross the river, and then with DRGs, and they're trying to not have that happen. Anyway, so it seems like the Russians are slowly but surely pushing the gray zone forward, and at the very least, it seems like the Ukrainian offensive here has been stopped, and now it's just a matter of reversing it. So we got another geolocation of the Russians being Berezova, for example. So it does show that as long as the Russians could try to hold on, kind of like in this area right here, and trying to stop any Ukrainian infiltrations here, that'll be good for them. But I do think that slowly but surely, there's probably no more Ukraine forces here. But I do think, but there's probably no Russian places. There's not like Russians are holding onto these tree lines, for example. But uh, all right, my thing shat its pants again. So, um, anyway, so there's that. Anyway, what am I doing here? All right, so uh, sorry, my headphones fucking took a shit. Anyway, um, yeah, so this is another big gray zone. Again, it's just a big back and forth slogging match, and it seems like the Russians are keeping the Ukrainians at bay at the moment, but again, it does complicate Russian pushes and all that, having to defend and such. And then on this eastern part right here, this is another area where a lot of mappers are being more like, for example, a lot of like Syriac, for example, said like the Russians got kicked out of Ternavata and Vosademka and so forth, and it's like I have no geolocation showing that was true. Maybe I'm not seeing like because obviously I don't have every single source, for example, right? But it does show that but what we did show, what Russians showed is that actually this week they've actually been doing expanding their offensive here. For example, they show them raising their flags in the town of Kopany, in Ravinia, and Lycia right here. And so if you look at what Russian sources are saying is that the front line kind of goes something like this, or actually even down like here. And another thing is that we had them raising their flags in the town of Novoselivka, this area right here. Now, as you can see, there's this giant gray zone that's developed here that honestly, I don't know why they've said that the Russians were kicked out of Virka Teresa or Vozhenzhenka, for example, but I mean, it's definitely possible for the Ukrainians to enter them probably, but I haven't seen that. Ternavata is another big one. I don't know if the Russians have re-entered. Like a lot of sources are saying Ternavata is being contested, that the Russians are still here. We had a geolocation of the Ukrainians being bombed in this village right here. I do think Rizhdanivka is probably mostly, is under Ukrainian control, but I think Ternavata is still being contested, but we shall see. Um, but again, but it does, regardless of the bridgehead here, I believe is still standing. The thing is that they're not advancing, and it's going to be very hard for the Russians to keep advancing towards even to take a Rekov this year. Before there was a big chance of them battling for Zaporizhia, but it seems like we'd be lucky for them if they even took a Rekov. It's just the Ukrainians put a bunch of their forces here. They really, really do not want the Russians reaching Zaporizhia. But yeah, so there's that. And but it does show that again, these areas are a lot more. Syriac I think is being a bit charitable to the Ukrainians. I do think that I do think that there's like probably a bigger gray zone that extends further westward than this shows here. I do think the Russians are have a more solid presence in this area. And so yeah, but we just need more information coming out. But again, the Russian, if the Russians are being counterattacked here, they need to solidify themselves here. They need to build up forces to continue pushing, and just to continue, having to, if they could secure this area here, this will be very good news for them. But again, the Ukrainians are making counterattacks and making a gray zone here. And then also the battle for Stepanhursk and Plopny is still ongoing. even in the southern part of Primorsk as well. There's a Ukrainian offensive here that kind of stopped, or at the very least, they probably just kicked. These areas that the Russians claimed are under their control are actually probably were just areas where they entered, but then they retreated and all that. So I do think the Russians are back on their kind of more stable line around Stepanhurst, but the Ukrainians are still trying to kick the Russians out of here. But the Russians really want to hold on to Stepanhurst. But it just seemed like the offensive here has stalled for the Ukrainians. And then now, lastly but not leastly, we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction. There's been actually some interesting things happening here as well. One of the biggest news is that there was some news happening that there was Russian DRGs active in these kind of mines toward the east of Dobropillya, for example, itself. So a lot of sources are actually saying that Nova Donbass has been finally captured by the Russians. It's probably been reduced to ruins though, so there's that. I do think what the Russians probably should do also is infiltrate this big mine right here. If they could take it, that will be a very big, will be a very big foreign to Belitska, and this could probably help facilitate the end of the battle for Belitska. We haven't had any. There's probably a battle for Belitska still ongoing, but it's still there's probably Russian infiltrations here, but then they get kicked out, and because there's been so it's just a big battle for the city as well. So and the Ukrainians aren't letting the Russians consolidate in Belitska, but it does show that this northern flank here, it seems like the Russians have expanded a bit here. The biggest news is probably coming around Grishny as well. In this last 2 weeks, the Russians have captured the town of Myrnia here. We had the Russians raising their defense in Vasilivka here. We had DRGs now are activating and infiltrating towards Shchentynivka here. So the Russians are probably going to try to take the town of Shchentynivka here as well. Probably have something like this going on. And along with this, the Russians are just slowly but surely pushing towards Sigurivka here. Taking these tree lines right here. And also we had another geolocation proving that Nova Pirodoria is under Russian control because we had a Russian soldier getting bombed in this western part here. So it does show that the Russians are in control of this village on the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast border. And then, so basically, slowly but surely, seems like what the Russians are doing is trying to take Sigurivka here. Because if they can take Sigurivka, that'll be a very big base of operations for the Russians to, help secure their flank a bit as they push towards Dobropillya. And then what else? Yeah, that's pretty much it for the Dobropillya direction. This is this is a kind of like a smaller gray zone, but yeah, there's like this kind of areas like kind of being kind of have infiltration. The thing is like the whole front line's kind of like this. The thing about like this map updates is that it's very hard to like actually say what's up and what's down and all that. Like there's no really strong control, especially in an active front. It's there's a lot of areas where it's like but it's not even like a lot of times it's not even just like just 50-50. Sometimes it's like maybe 80-20. Maybe it's like you have some positions where the Russians take a position, but then the Ukrainians are still behind you in another position. Like for example, if we go to the Slavyansk area, there might be, the Russians are consolidating this village, but maybe there's still Ukrainians held up in this tree line right behind them, for example. So it's just like, and there's also obviously infiltrations where maybe it's not solidified, but they're still active, like troops battling there. It's a very big, thick mess and all that. So it's hard to talk about things. You have to kind of be more generalized, but yeah. But that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. Hope you guys be sure to subscribe to continue receiving these updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. I hope you guys have a wonderful summer so far. So aim high and wander on.